Kia ora. Kia ora whānau, kia ora everybody. Welcome and thank you all for joining tonight's virtual town hall, Nau Mai Haere Mai. Tonight we are continuing our kōrero on reimagining Aotearoa, and we have a focus tonight on last week's big budget 2020 announcements. Over to you, James.
Yeah, that's right. So tonight we are talking about Budget 2020, which of course came out on Thursday last week, what was in it, and what it means for Aotearoa, New Zealand. If you've joined us on one of our previous town halls, of course we've had guests from around New Zealand and actually in some cases from around the world. So tonight we're mixing it up a wee bit. Marama and I are joined by a special guest from our own caucus, Eugenie Sage and Jan Logie.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this discussion tonight. Before we get started though, I'd just like to go through a few housekeeping points before we get underway. I will then start with a karakia just so we can run tonight's kōrero as smoothly as possible. So you may have noticed a poll pop right up on your screen there. Feel free to fill this out so we can get an understanding of whereabouts in the country people are tuning in from. And as always, there will be a time for questions throughout this webinar. People can put your question in the chat, which you should be able to see with the button along the bottom of your screen. And your messages will be sent through to myself and James and our panelists. Anything else, James?
Just that we're not just on Zoom tonight, we're also broadcasting live on YouTube. So we've got about 160 people here on the Zoom channel, and we'll have quite a lot of people watching us on YouTube as well. If you want your friends or your family to be able to watch as well, we're going to be posting the link into the chat on Zoom, and you can please feel free to send that to your whānau and to your friends if they want to catch us on YouTube.
Okay, so I'd like to start us off with a karakia, and this is a karakia written by Scotty Morrison and generously gifted for all of us to be able to use. Tū tawa mai I raro, tū tawa mai I roto, tū tawa mai I waho. Kia tau wai te mauri tū, te mauri ora ki te katoa, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Summon from above, summon from below, summon from within and the surrounding environment, the universal vitality and energy to infuse and enrich all present, unified, connected, and blessed. Kia ora, over to you, James.
Thanks, Marama. So we'll be bringing in our special guest stars, Eugenie Sage and Jan Logie, shortly. But first of all, Marama and I are going to talk a little bit about what is in the budget and what some of the green wins were during the course of the whole year. And it was a really big budget for us, hugely successful. I have to say, we're feeling quite proud of it. The budget was composed in fact, it's actually composed of four main pieces. So back in January, you might remember the government made an announcement about an infrastructure upgrade of about $12 billion. And then as we were going into the pandemic crisis, of course, we had to rewrite the whole budget from scratch. So normally a budget takes about 6 months to put together. We were just putting the finishing touches on Budget 2020 when the pandemic crisis hit. And so the whole thing got rewritten in a very short period of time. And the first phase of our response to the pandemic were things that were dealing with the very immediate health crisis. So for example, the big boost to health funding to ensure that we had all the right equipment and so on, and that we were able to get people onto the ground. Things like the wage subsidy to make sure that people who were having to work from home could continue to be paid and so on. So some of those support for people and some of those support for businesses. Then last Thursday, we announced the budget, and that included a $50 billion contingency fund, quite a lot of which has already been spent on the first phase of the budget. The first phase of the response to the pandemic crisis. But a lot of what last week's budget was about jobs, and that's sort of phase two. So within the this particular part of where we stand, it is really important that we focus on jobs, because we know we're pretty sure looking good for having fought off the virus itself. We now need to face the fact that there's been a huge contraction in the economy. A lot of people are out of work, and that's going to continue to grow over the coming weeks and months. So this budget really first was about trying to make sure that we keep as many people in their jobs as possible. Second, where that's not possible, it's about ensuring that they have access to education and training to be able to move into a new job as soon as possible. Third, it's about ensuring that people have the assistance that they need to be able to continue to put food on the table if they currently don't have a job, if they're if they're sort of part of the unemployed wave that's going through at the moment. And fourth, and this is actually where a lot of our stuff was located, it's actually about directly investing in the creation of new jobs, and to ensure that people have got access to work, particularly those regions which are very badly hit by the economic fallout of the pandemic crisis. So that was the sort of construction of the budget. Obviously, it did a lot of other things, but that was really the priority within it. And then you'll be able to see when Marama starts to talk through what were some of the things that came out of the budget, just how that sort of fits in. The Greens have always said that the best way to create meaningful jobs, well-paid jobs, quickly is by investing in nature. And so we were really delighted that one of the centerpieces of the budget was our Green Jobs package. And Marama will go into a little bit about what that is in a minute. Our predecessors in the Green Party, 12 years ago, when the great financial crisis hit, started to campaign for a Green New Deal. But unfortunately, at the time, of course, we were in opposition. So we weren't in a position really to do much about it. This time, of course, in the government, we are in a position to do something about it. And so while we're really pleased with our ability to get some of those fundamental design ideas about a Green New Deal into this budget. Now, before, when I was talking about the different phases, there is still another big phase to come. And beyond the phase that we're currently in. That's what we call wave 3, which is really about the longer term. What kind of economy do we hope and do we want to see in the 12 to 24 months from now? And for us, whilst we were really pleased to get the Green Jobs package and various other things into this budget, we will now be turning our attention also onto ensuring that this is indeed a green reset. And a lot of the ideas and the discussions that we've had over the past few weeks on these town halls have been about reimagining what kind of Aotearoa we want as the rebuild comes. So one of the things that I said in my budget speech last week was we shouldn't just think about this as a recovery, but as a renewal of our relationship with nature and with each other. Marama.
Kia ora. That's exactly right, James. And, we really pushed for this budget and a post-COVID response to focus on the long-term protection of our environment and also putting our people first. And I'm really pleased that we got exactly what we pushed for in terms of that focus on sustainability. So right now, I'm just going to sort of whip through a bit about what was included in the budget. So Thursday's announcement was just the start of Aotearoa's post-COVID response. And I'm really pleased it kicked off by securing, $1.1 billion for new green jobs across the motu of Aotearoa, $5.7 billion towards reducing housing inequality, $202 million for a government response to family and sexual violence, $207 million to provide and extend food in schools for tamariki. I have to apologise, I've got a crying mokopuna in the hallway, so I'll just, there we go. $900 million to support Māori communities specifically to recover from COVID-19, $33 million for the family reunification system, $20 million for the Student Hardship Fund, and $1.3 billion to improve transport across the country, including our intercity rail network and the Inter-Islander. I want to also make it clear that announced earlier in the year, we talked about $1.6 billion towards improving our regional rail networks and cycling infrastructure, $200 million to move hospital and schools to renewable energy, that's out of the dirty coal burners, $2.9 billion towards improving our welfare system, especially as we went into lockdown. Now, that's very high level, and we'll go into the detail of some of these key announcements very soon. But I just want to reiterate that this is just the start, and particularly those things which the Greens did push very hard for. From my perspective, it was really important that we got a lot of that budget secured for, as James went through earlier, that focus on jobs in this particular case. We know that people's livelihoods and how to replenish our community can come particularly from people directly in communities having good jobs, trying to hold on to jobs that we did have beforehand, as well as creating new jobs, and for people who are not in paid employment, being able to support themselves, support their family. And all of this, of course, will go towards replenishing their local communities. So I just wanted to sort of reiterate that there's more to come. We'll, of course, be doing, and we can talk about some of that tonight, we'll be doing our absolute best to ensure that that investment that is happening puts us and our future generations on track for a fairer Aotearoa where both our people and our environment can thrive. So back to you for this moment, James.
Yeah, kia ora Marama. So that was actually just a partial list. Those were kind of the big headlines. There were actually 72 different budget initiatives that the Greens put in or supported that came through. So we were pretty pleased with our progress this time. Now we're going to be bringing our first guest, Eugenie Sage, on shortly. But before I do, I just want to say again, if you've just joined us recently, that we're both on Zoom, but also on YouTube. So if you're watching us on YouTube, g'day, nice to see you. And remember that, of course, we will be answering your questions a bit later on this evening. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And our team of elves will pass them and make sure that Marama and I and Eugenie and Jan get them and answer them as we go. So good evening, and I think what we're going to do now is to bring on Eugenie. Eugenie.
Kia ora, Eugenie. Awesome to have you with us. Welcome to our town hall tonight.
Kia ora, Marama. Kia ora, James. Kia ora whānau. Great to be here. So James and Marama have talked about one of the keynote pieces of the budget, which was a $1.1 billion package to provide 11,000 nature-based jobs. It was something the Greens really pushed hard for, and it's something we delivered. And just acknowledge all of the mahi of organisations like Greenpeace, iwi and hapu, councils, Forest and Bird, and others who championed a green reset in the light of COVID. And this 1.1 billion has got a number of components. There's 433 million to really work to restore wetlands and our waterways, to improve the health of rivers and particularly our largest harbour, the kaipara, which is so important for wading birds, for snapper nursery, and for iwi and hapu and people around the kaipara. Then there's another 200 million for a jobs and nature fund that Te Papa Atawhai will work alongside regional councils, iwi and hapu, and tourism businesses and the like, particularly where people have been really hard hit by the economic downturn, providing jobs. It may only be for 6 months to 12 months until businesses get back on their feet, but giving people an experience to work on nature-based jobs. Then there's another 154 million for enhancing nature and biodiversity on public and private land. And there have been proposals by people like Te Whanau Apanui and Ngāti Porou for the Raukumara forest because of the impacts of deer and browsers there, and working with organisations like the Queen Elizabeth II National Trust. So quite a big package there. And then another 147 million to enhance predator-free Aotearoa and really work towards that vision with controlling pests and weeds. And those of you who know about wilding conifers, it's where we get pine trees that are growing in the wrong place, particularly in tussock grasslands in the South Island and the Mackenzie, Central North Island, 100 million for people to work on chopping those trees down, particularly for forestry workers who've been hard hit by the downturn. And then Land Information New Zealand is getting 40 million. It's responsible for quite a lot of crown land in riverbeds in the South Island and also lake beds in the Rotorua Lakes, Lakes Wanaka and Whakatipu, controlling aquatic weeds there. And finally, 27 million to control wallabies. They are a major pest in the Waikato, in the Bay of Plenty. The little Dharma wallaby, they're spreading, they're a browser in our forests, and then the bigger Bennett's wallaby in Otago and Canterbury. So controlling those. So this is investing now that will provide major benefits for nature and for future generations. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Eugenie. This is obviously really significant for you as Conservation Minister, you know, working alongside Department of Conservation with Ministry of Primary Industries and Ministry for the Environment, councils, iwi and hapu, environmental NGOs. It's a really huge deal in terms of just the scale of it compared to kind of anything that we've ever done previously. One of the things I really like about it is that, you know, whilst we're out there healing nature, it does kind of get into some of the hardest to reach parts of New Zealand. And in particular, those areas where obviously the downturn in tourism has meant that you're seeing a real upswing in unemployment, because of course the reason why those places are tourism hotspots is because they're areas of outstanding natural beauty. And so there does seem to be a difference here between the way that we're doing a regeneration, a recovery package versus sort of previous recovery packages for other crises, which have tended to focus on a few major kind of hero projects. This seems to kind of get you know, employment and money out into the regions and into the areas that need it the most.
And it's recognising too that conservation in Aotearoa, with all of our Indigenous species, we need everyone involved. So it's a real opportunity, maybe for people who've been involved in tourism businesses, say in Queenstown, to actually go out and do more for nature and supercharge our conservation efforts to protect the 4,000 species that are threatened or at risk of extinction.
Kia ora, Eugenie. Kia ora, James. And what I wanted to add from your roundup, Eugenie, is this is ticking a lot of wins. It's creating good jobs with good pay for thousands of people around our country. It is protecting our treasured living spaces and living systems for generations to come. But I think too, particularly important is it's a way to start reconnecting ourselves with the fact that papatuanuku actually is in our whakapapa, that we have become disconnected from our living systems, from the life cycle as a whole over recent years, and that these sorts of jobs and this way of stimulating and replenishing our community is actually a way of re-healing, restarting that relationship that we should have always had with nature. And that's for me is one of the heartfelt wins of that particular package. So kia ora, Eugenie. What I really want to know, just sort of, we're going to have lots more discussion. What I really want to know is what you all watching think about it also. So, and we've seen some fabulous questions come through on the chat. So for those of us on Zoom, you'll see another poll pop up on the screen to let us know what you think about Eugenie's Green Jobs package, and we'll sort of gather those results and show you the results soon. So make sure you get to have your say. Alternatively, if you're watching on YouTube, and I'm told that we do have a good crowd of people gathering on YouTube, just checking my data there. You can also react or post a comment as well if you're watching on YouTube. I think it's over to you, James.
That's right. So next up, we're going to move on to another of our colleagues, Jan Logie. Jan, if you'd like to join us. Kia ora, Jan. So Jan, you've also had a pretty big win in this budget, actually just before there was a pre-announcement, but then also on the day as well, in the area that you're responsible for in government. So why don't you lead us through that?
Cool, thanks. So in government, I have a role, and it's the first time it's the first time we've ever had somebody with a specific focus on bringing everyone's work together towards ending family and sexual violence in the country. And last year we had the largest budget ever towards that goal, and this year we had the second largest budget towards that end. And over the last 2 years we've now committed over $500 million towards this work, because it is pretty fundamental to that, just as our relationship with nature is to well-being. We can't really be healthy or well if we're scared or fundamentally hurt. So this year's budget built on last year's, where last year we had a focus around getting funding towards our specialist sexual violence services, about starting the work around prevention, which is so important, and trying to make sure that we were linking up all the different bits of work across government and the communities, so that we were all kind of enhancing each other's work rather than undermining it, which we've been doing for too long. So this year's focus has really been about making sure that we got the resources to the front lines. So that's about community organisations working with victims and their whānau, about people, the specialist response for elder abuse, about making sure that the people who are helping people who've used violence to stop, that they're properly resourced, as well as for children and young people. And then there was additional resources around making sure that people, if their partner's left but they are still stalking them, that they've got a security system to enable them to safely stay in their home and feel confident. And developing a specialist response for suffocation or strangulation. This is, it's difficult stuff, but we've had, since developing that specific charge in December 2018, we've had an average 5 arrests a day for that through the police, and it increases the likelihood of a fatal fatality 7-fold if somebody has been strangled or suffocated. So it's really important that we're getting the right support to people who've experienced that. And that's also supported by the other wider government work around improving whānau ora and our court system, and getting more resources to children as well. So it's a whole kind of comprehensive response.
Kia ora, sorry, my apologies. Kia ora, Jan. What I really am having huge hope for the way that you and others are leading this quite historical change of how to deal with domestic violence, Jan, is that I think everything is operating in an ecosystem or a life cycle, if you like, and it's now understanding the role that each of the different groups, different parts of community have to play together, working together in addressing and providing those frontline services to reduce domestic violence. So I'm particularly pleased to see the leadership from yourself and working with agencies across the board to bring that to bear through funding from this government. So I'm really pleased about that. Kia ora.
And I would just say, it's really, I think it's kind of, on some level it sounds a bit nerdy, but it is really exciting to see a different way of doing government where we're able to break down those silos, whereas before, the police might have a focus and they might be driving ahead, but there wasn't funding for the frontline community organisations to be able to support them in that part of the work. And that was because MSD made that decision and they weren't able or weren't talking to each other. And housing, again, was another problem over here. So now we're joining all of those dots in partnership with Māori and our specialist community organisations, that just gives us a chance to really get on top of this to the point where ending it doesn't have to be a dream.
Yeah, I think, Jan, I have to say, I honestly think that's going to be one of the big legacies of this government, is seriously tackling domestic and sexual violence for the first time, but doing it in a way that actually redesigns the way that we do government. And not a lot of people know this, but I do because I'm a budget minister, and so I see how Treasury and, Grant and, everybody reacts. Jan's work in pulling together, I think, was it something like 14 different ministers and 10 different ministries, departments and agencies to collaborate to put together these funding packages, has been groundbreaking in terms of the way that we organise government and do budgets in New Zealand. And so I think we're feeling really hopeful about the results that we're going to start to see as this starts to make an impact in the community. Now, you don't need me to rabbit on about this. Interested in hearing what you've got to say about it. So we're going to pop up another poll. Interested in us hearing from you about what you think about the funding package for family violence support services, and that should be up on your screen for a few moments. So we'll just give you a minute to get that in. And what we're going to do, thanks for that. What we're going to do now is we're going to start turning to questions. So, Jan, I'm going to kick off, if you don't mind, which is how much of it is, this is the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff question, right? So how much of it, you mentioned prevention when you were talking about it, how much of that package is going to trying to stop it from happening in the first place to kind of, cleaning it up after it's happened, and how do you distinguish between those two things?
I wish there was a tidy answer to that, but I want to acknowledge that question which came in ahead of tonight's meeting, because I think it is one of the most important questions to ask. And that under the last government, they did a stock take of government spending and found that it was less than 1.5% was going on prevention. I don't have the update on that percentage yet, but we are working on that at the moment. And so this budget doesn't have money for primary prevention. That was in last year's budget, and that's still rolling out, and we're developing that over time. So there was over 30 million in the last budget for Pacifica Proud, E Tu Whānau, and the It's Not Okay campaign. But this year's budget, there is funding for working with people who've used violence, and we know that if we do that well, we stop further violence. And there's also funding for working with children and young people who've been living in contexts of family violence, which we have just not put the resource towards. And when we don't actually help heal the trauma or help young people understand and unlearn the lessons that they've absorbed in that violent situation, many of those children either go on to hurt other people that they love later in life. That's how that cycle works. So I'm incredibly excited to see money starting to go into that area. And I also just want to acknowledge that typically it's our Māori organisations and what we call generally, then there's massive crossover, our specialist organisations who are doing the work on the front lines. Typically, they're the ones that push government to get our response right. And typically our response, we've been the biggest part of the problem in this scenario. And that is essential if we are to prevent more violence in the future. So that also counts. Long answer.
No, great. Really important question, as you said, Jen. Jen, I've got a second question to put up for you. One moment. Okay. Jen, how important is it for government to work with frontline services?
Absolutely, and it's critical. And I think that's been one of the really exciting things, if it feels appropriate, I'm not sure it does to say that, over the last couple of months through the pandemic, is that actually there's been the specialist services set up a pandemic working group from Frontline, who had a direct voice into all the government agencies and were able to give us, in effect, real-time feedback on the impact of what government agencies were doing. Government agencies develop funding proposals and policies, and we tend to just put them in place and think they're going to deliver what we thought they would. They don't always. And so it was amazing to get that feedback and be able to change what we were doing and get the advice to feed in to make it the best possible response. And we just hear again, just so clearly, all of the research tells us that our response for Māori has not been working, and that we need to make a fundamental shift, and that there's huge potential for transformation if we can release the tikanga, the protective tikanga within Te Ao Māori. And government can't do that. The history has been violent and painful, but there's a chance for us to have a completely different future by working in that partnership.
Kia ora, Jan. I'm going to go to James shortly, who's going to ask, go back to Eugenie for some questions. So right now I'm going to invite Eugenie back on screen. Kia ora, Eugenie, over to you, James.
Eugenie, just to kick us off in this domain, and then what we'll do is we'll then start bringing through some of the questions that we've gathered from the chat this evening. But just to get us warmed up, the Jobs for Nature package is obviously, you know, wetlands and wilding pines and wallabies and predator-free and planting riparian strips and all of that kind of stuff, which is great. Question is, are there plans for other types of green job in the future, such as insulating homes, putting solar panels onto roofs, any of those other kinds of things that that we've talked about in the domain of green jobs in the past?
Kia ora, James. Well, certainly there've been quite a lot of questions too coming through about climate, and that investment in pest control, particularly in our forests, makes them much more efficient at carbon sequestration. But in the wave 3 that you also mentioned, there is quite a big push to get some more investment in waste, because New Zealand's got a really rubbish record on waste. Despite our commitment to doing recycling, the volume of waste going to landfill has been increasing over the last decade, and we've got a big infrastructure hole, estimated at about $1 billion. So we in the Greens are pushing for more investment in waste so that we can recover more materials, reprocess them here in Aotearoa, and create more jobs in the process. And because waste going to landfill accounts for 5% of our greenhouse emissions, that will also reduce climate change emissions.
Thanks, Eugenie. There was another question that we had about whether some of the jobs that are going to be created aren't just those ones, you know, that we've been describing, but also some of the things to help DOC do its statutory functions. So scientists and analysts and ecologists and, you know, all of those kinds of core functions of the Department of Conservation. Does the funding include that?
So in budget 18 and 19, there was quite a significant investment, 181 million in new funding over 4 years in each of those budgets. And one of my key priorities as Minister was ensuring that Te Papa Arawhai stood alongside iwi, hapu, fish and game, forest and bird, community organisations who were standing up for nature. So the department's got a function to advocate for nature, told them to go and do that, and there was quite a chunk of extra funding so that more planners and scientists and technical folk have been employed so that they can stand up in front of councils and say, these developments are going to impact nature. This is a way you can do it, which won't do that. So that funding's already been provided for that.
Great.
So
So this isn't just a sort of a, sorry, Eugenie?
Sorry, James. This 1.1 billion is more about investing in nature as our essential infrastructure. As Marama said, Papatūānuku, giving Papatūānuku a helping hand because we need nature for our well-being.
That's great. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt you. I was just saying that it's good that it isn't just about the sort of the short-term need for jobs, but that this is going to make a really long-term difference to our natural heritage. I know I keep saying that we're going to throw it over to your questions quickly, but just before we do, we're going to ask Marama to fill you in a little bit on some of the stuff in the domain of housing in this budget as well, because obviously that's an area that the Greens have campaigned on, and actually particularly Marama has campaigned on for many years, and there was some pretty significant stuff in Budget 2020 on that too. So Marama.
Kia ora. Yeah, look, with the Greens have been really clear that housing needs to be seen as a public good, as a fundamental human right, as opposed to just a way to make, for people who are already wealthy, to make even more money while people are struggling with lower incomes to pay things like rent and mortgage. So I was really pleased to see in this budget 2020 funding to build around 6,000 new public and community houses, and that's to ensure low-income families have access to warm, dry, affordable and secure housing. We know that housing is an incredible driver of people living in poverty, of people not having the means to live decent lives. We know that not having enough affordable, healthy, safe housing can entrench low-income communities and families for generations, living from day to day, living from hour to hour, as we have already seen. So that funding to around 6,000 new public and community houses, as well as funding for an extra 2,000 new temporary houses. So people are probably aware that for too many years, actually, we have had to use things like motels, private businesses, to put people living rough, people living in cars and garages, people living in overcrowded houses, into shorter term, what is often called transitional housing, that needs to remain to be seen as a temporary solution, purely to move people into longer term sustainable housing. And so an extra 2,000 houses for temporary housing is going to help us move away from leaning on private businesses the way that we have been. And we understood that that was going to be better while we didn't have those places. In the meantime, we cannot accept that people have to live in cars or garages and overcrowded housing. So I understood where we ended up using the likes of motels, private business motels, but we want to move away from that. And the Greens have been very clear that we have to move away from that. So I'm particularly pleased to see a gap. We're filling that sort of gap at the moment. Now, of course, we can't just accept for people to live in any old home. And we know that for far too long, again, our houses here have been cold. On an international basis, our houses have been at least 1 or 2 degrees below what they should be. We know that new hospital admissions every winter skyrocket, with children and old people and other people becoming sick just from the state of poor condition homes. So extending our investment to ensure another 9,000 homes, another 9,000 homes are warm and dry for people through adequate insulation and heating, is absolutely something that I'm really pleased to see, and particularly in its relationship with how COVID-19 responds and thrives, and the conditions that it responds and thrives in. So we know this is essential. So that extension to a 9,000 extra warm homes is absolutely needed. These builds, of course, both the public and community housing, the temporary home places, and the further insulation and heating are also going to create jobs, the jobs that we know will replenish the local communities for the people that those very jobs are going to be based in. So I think that's just a sort of high-level overview for now of the key and important announcements that were in Budget 2020. Thank you, James.
Yeah, and that's certainly got people excited. I've been sitting here while you were talking, Marama, looking at the chat screen, and there are tons of questions coming through on housing. So I'll just kick one of them to you now. This one's from Nigel Murray. He says, the health of our people has only had funding for a small number of existing homes to have a small amount of insulation and LEDs. The improvement of all existing homes to a much higher than building code level would be job creating, climate change impacting, and future proofing. Can we have more as soon as possible, please? What do you say to that?
Oh, absolutely. Was it Nigel, James?
Yes.
Yes. I couldn't agree with you more, Nigel. Can I just acknowledge Gareth Hughes in this term of Parliament, who has been absolutely pushing and adamant for this whole term and previous terms about the need for us to build homes that are going to take us into the future, homes that are going to allow us to meet the crises that we are facing today of climate change, inequality, and environmental degradation, that looking after people, that making sure our communities are building warm, energy efficient, safe homes, that what we are building with is going to protect our environment as well as reduce emissions into our climate, that how we are building is also going to have to answer those questions as well. Everything is connected. So we will continue at the moment, and I think this is also probably now James going to answer another pre-question that we came through, but it's all connected with what Nigel has been asking about. At the moment, finally, yay, the kāinga ora, or the sort of Crown and public builds, all have to be built to a minimum of Homestar 6 rating. Homestar 6 rating, just quickly, is an independent, not-for-profit green building council, sort of a quality mark for homes that are safe and warm and energy efficient. But Homestar rating 6 is something we push for a long time, and it's important that we eventually got to that Homestar 6 rating. We also know that we should be aiming for the highest rating, so it can go up to Homestar rating 10. We should absolutely be thinking about, for example, the most energy efficient way of heating our homes, not just double glazing. I know some of the sort of passive housing that we are starting to see today includes triple glazing, a way that uses our grey water, a way that has more sustainable ways of using our wastewater. What sort of toilets do we use? How do we insulate our water storage? Do we use solar? All of those sorts of dynamics absolutely need to be pushed for, and it's what the Greens will continue to push for. I'm glad we've got to a starting place of Homestar 6, but we can do so much better as well. Kia ora.
Thanks, Marama. I've got another one for you. This one's from Chris Ford. He says, I'm pleased about all the new social housing spend, but we also need even more public houses built according to universal design accessibility standards. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, Chris. And again, I will want to acknowledge our former MP, Mojo Mathers, and all of the community organisations who for so long, for generations in fact, have been insisting that all of our world needs to be universally designed, not just our homes, all of our buildings, all of our public places, all of our businesses, our schools, our hospitals need to be built in a way that it is accessible for everyone. And I am privileged, I am an able-bodied person, but even just, it would help more people. I've got experience of pushing around prams around cities and communities and suburbs, trying to get in and out of buildings and public transport. And universal design would be good for everybody, would be good for our long-term plans of how we build and what we build with. And I know that we will be calling on that ongoing advocacy that, as I said, many organisations have been asking us to do, and I welcome that ongoing pressure for government to move towards universal design. Yes.
Thanks, Marama. Next question is for Eugenie, and then I think Marama will flip into a conversation with Jan. So there's been a number of questions actually, so this is a bit of a composite question from a number of people, and this was about a piece by Rod Oram today with Catherine Ryan. So what he was saying was that the green elements of the budget package, in particular he mentioned pest control, riparian planting and weed removal, is short-termism and not systemic change needed to address climate change. And do you have any thoughts on this view and how to counter that narrative?
Kia ora. So unless we invest in nature now, because we've got the twin crises of the climate crisis and the nature crisis. So I would normally agree with Rod, but I don't think it's short-termism at all, because it's connecting people with nature, having people recognise the value of nature in our lives and to us, and its value for its own sake. So to me, that is really long-term. And even with COVID, with the slightly slower pace, it's not that more birds have come back into our cities, but people are observing those more. So just recognising the importance of nature. I think and with the crisis too, the economic insecurity, we need to provide people with livelihoods. We have a lot of work that can be done that is shovel ready, because the shovels to plant shrubs and trees alongside rivers, you don't need all of that big planning that the big infrastructure projects need. And it is healthy nature on which we depend. I mean, this crisis started because of a wet market in Wuhan where bats were being sold. And we need to make space for nature. So it is long-term thinking to have healthy nature, and we can't have a healthy climate without healthy nature. And some of this work, like the planting around the margins of estuaries, helps buffer areas from sea level rise. Having healthy wetlands helps protect water quality because they're the natural filters. So it's investing longer term and actually reshaping the way we think about our economy so that it serves nature, it serves people, rather than the other way around.
Thanks, Eugenie. I think one of the other things to point out is that there was, I sort of made a reference to this earlier on, is that the things have really staged out in this budget. So back in January, we had the infrastructure upgrade, then we had the first wave of the COVID response, then the second component is the jobs budget, which was last week, and then the third component, which really is yet to come, and will draw on some of the that $50 billion contingency fund that hasn't been spent yet. And the intention there is to think about what is the shape of the economy that we want in the future. And so I just wanted to draw on some of the things that you were mentioning before. You were looking for significant investments in waste, which of course is a fairly large source of emissions. We're talking about some possibilities in relation to renewable energy, and particularly solar and wind, and so on. And so some of those things Cabinet hasn't yet decided upon, but will ultimately come out of this budget package. But just because of the way it's structured, what wasn't announced last week. So I think Grant's been referring to it as something of a rolling maul, but that's because he's also the sports minister as well as the finance minister.
James, if I'm going to ask you to move us to, which I know there are a lot of questions about, what wasn't included in the budget, if you would like.
Well, I think so. Some of what I was just talking about then were things that which weren't included in the budget, shall I say, yet, but we're still hoping to make some pretty significant investments in. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot about recently is because we are basically borrowing a colossal amount of money, ultimately from future generations, in order to get us through this pandemic crisis. We have a real responsibility to invest that money, to make it go to work on things that actually make those the lives of and livelihoods of those future generations better, and reducing risks and reducing costs to them. Otherwise, they get a double whammy. They have to pay back the cost of this pandemic crisis, but they also have to pay for the impact of another crisis, like the climate crisis, for example. So it is utterly critical that we do take the opportunity here now to invest in the long-term challenges facing New Zealand, like the climate crisis, like the housing crisis, like the crisis in taps and pipes underground, which are making so many people sick, and so on. And so a lot of those things really are yet to come, because that's, I guess, the next component of what the budget's all about. Similarly, there's obviously going to need to be some thinking about how we support people better in this country. You know, the budget contained about $2.9 billion worth of support for people in the form of an additional $25 a week to all main benefits, plus indexing benefits, plus the doubling of the winter energy payment, although that is just for this year. That obviously makes a difference, but it doesn't come within cooey of what people actually need, given the pressure on people at the moment. And so that is something that we're going to continue to push for, whether it's through this budget round or with any luck, once we win the election in 16 weeks' time, and have a go at next year's budget as well.
Kia ora, James, thank you. You've sort of touched on how we need to properly support our least supported and least resourced people, the people with the least power, while also, and how that relates to reducing our emissions and setting ourselves up for responding to and addressing climate change. And what wasn't included in the budget, and I'd like to pick up with Jan and Eugenie, who I think you're both on screen with us, because I know you've also got lots to say. Can I go to you, Jan, first? For example, what else do you think is needed, Jan, to fix our welfare system?
Well, as part of our confidence and supply agreement going into government, we supported the establishment of the Welfare Expert Advisory Group, which was a group of a really, I think, quite representative group of New Zealanders, from academics and economists and business people and people with experience of the welfare system, and doctors and young people and people with disabilities, who all examined all of the evidence and came up with a pretty thorough report, giving us I think 42 recommendations of what we needed to do. And I think that represents the potential to build consensus in the country. And the top line of their report, which is called Whakamana Tangata, and it's about how we restore dignity and enable everyone to thrive and have that opportunity in life to be able to support themselves and their families, was that there was an urgent need to address completely inadequate incomes and for fundamental change. And it's been fantastic to see support for that growing, that we've had the unions who now, in response to COVID, where we used to have this idea of working people over here and people who were not working over here, despite the fact that that's not real, and that we have really high turnover, one of the highest in the developed world, in and out of work. More and more people are starting to see that actually maybe the system, they're going to need it. So unions have been really strong advocates recently, along with a growing number of community organisations and community leaders. And that's where we've been coming from in the Greens, is just getting behind that and pushing for increase in benefits, enabling people to have an individualized benefit, so that they're not forced into dependency on a partner, which can be really unsafe. And for people with disabilities where there's social constructs of dependency, can be particularly painful and limiting. So there's huge potential for us to do more to really renew our society.
Thank you, Jen, for pointing that out very clearly, because we know that there are a lot of people who urgently need us to increase those lowest incomes, that this would have an impact on families, communities, and actually future generations. Eugenie, I'd like to come to you next to talk about what else you think wasn't in budget that should have been and that could be.
Kia ora. We're always very ambitious, but with a team of only 8, which is why we need to substantially increase the green vote, we can do so much more. So particularly in the waste space, as I said before, there's an over $1 billion hole in waste infrastructure, and it's meant that we've been sending waste to places like Malaysia, creating problems for them. And it's ensuring that with all the different sorts of materials that we can actually reprocess them here. It's doing a lot more work to avoid creating waste in the first place, and we'll have some announcements on product stewardship coming up soon. But it is that big investment too in things like community resource recovery centres. So if you have got furniture that you're not using, or so that doesn't go to landfill, somebody else can use it. So Auckland, for example, has got very few of these. So we can have a more efficient economy and one that has a much lower environmental footprint if the Crown starts out by investing in some of this infrastructure that we need to get our waste to landfill substantially reduced. And we always need more for nature.
Always. I'm going to sort of put some views onto that before I go to James, who will then add his views on. But I've been thinking about how this is all linked. How does making sure that people have enough to live decent lives and live with dignity, how does that relate to protecting our natural world and our living systems for many generations to come? And how does that relate to reducing our emissions to guard ourselves as much as we can against climate change, and to designing a different way of relating to each other, our economy and our natural world for a climate healthy future? And I wanted to, a lot of you have already heard me talk about this example where often I talk about housing, often I talk about increasing the lowest incomes, overhauling our welfare system. And also on my social media platforms, I talk about the environment, I talk about climate change. Once I put up a post about taking action to protect our climate, and I got a really serious bit of feedback from someone who said, I'm worried about where I'm going to live this week. I'm worried about how I'm going to put food on my family's table. And you're asking me to think about taking action on climate change. And I just can't make that connection right now on getting involved in that action, because I'm really worried about the next hour, the next day, and the next week of actually surviving. So I really wanted to raise that example again of how we need to address all these issues, and because all these issues are absolutely connected. And my second comment is that, and I'm thinking about people like amazing advocates like Chris Ford, who just asked a question tonight. The way that our economy has been set up to exploit people and nature for short-term profit and gain, what that has required is setting people against each other to achieve that short-term gain and that focus on material wealth, that focus on individual gain, has required us to buy into a narrative of competing against other because there's not enough in the world to go around. And what has happened is that has marginalized many different groups and communities, and it has marginalized people on low incomes, people in poorer communities. It has certainly trampled on Indigenous communities and our ways of living. It has certainly trampled on people with disabilities. It has also created a quite patriarchal world and allowed for the rife sexism that has led to a lot of the domestic violence and sexual abuse that Jan Logie is working on as well. So all of those connections that have required us to compete against each other have allowed for a way of operating that continues to exploit people on low incomes, for low incomes, and continues to extract from our living systems, which are damaging both our environment and our climate and our people. So I just wanted to add my sort of thoughts around how all of these issues are completely linked. And over to you, James.
Well, we're coming to the end of our hour together. So I was just going to wrap it up just by flipping just what you were saying, Marama, into coming back to the budget and this notion around jobs, is that actually all of the things that you're talking about and solving all of those issues, coincidentally, is incredibly jobs intensive, right? So insulating homes so that they're warm and dry and putting solar panels on the roof, that takes creates a lot of jobs per dollar spent. Actually, building houses creates more jobs per dollar spent than building a road by some orders of magnitude, because most of that other work is done by machines. The caring professions, frankly, only jobs intensive, right? It's hugely intensive. So all of the things that we need to do to heal society, to keep us together, to fix the environment and all of the issues that we've got there, actually, if we invest in those things, then that will also get us through the pandemic crisis and the economic downturn, and ensure that everybody has enough to put a roof over their head, food on the table, and to look after themselves and their whānau. And I think that pretty much brings us to the end of our session tonight.
Kia ora, again, a massive mihi to Jan Logie and Eugenie Sage and my co-leader, James Shaw. I am going to wrap us up with a karakia very shortly. I believe that there is a last chance to fill out our survey and share with people you know, unless I've just missed James already saying that, but kei te pai. So I believe there will be a link put into the chat. Okay, to wrap up, a lot of yesterday was, I want to acknowledge that yesterday for many, many people was the first day back at school. For many of our children was the first day back in physical workplace, also for a lot of others. And I want to acknowledge that for some, that has meant some very understandable a level of anxiety, a level of not feeling quite so certain and sure of what's going on. And again, I wanted to close us off with a karakia that was composed again by Scotty Morrison, and it was written for whānau and tamariki as a goodnight karakia to acknowledge that sense of anxiety that is quite a bit obvious right at this particular time. So if I can just bring us together with that. Aio ana te rangi, aio ana te whenua, aio ana te ao katoa, aio ana te moi a te whānau, I roto I te mai, te matihere, me te maoriori e, kia au, kia au, kia au te moi. The sky is tranquil, the earth is still, everything is calm, our whānau sleeps peacefully, immersed in deep love and contentment. Sleep well. Pō mare e, kia ora everybody.